Shut up, man.
Listen, China ate your lunch, Joe.
You're the worst president America has ever had.
Hey,
Come
Joe,
on. I'm not here to call out his lies. Everybody knows he's a liar.
But you
I just
agree.
want to
Hey,
make
Joe,
sure.
you're the liar.
I want to make sure.
I graduated last in your class when I first
That's true.
Gentlemen, I hate to raise my voice, but I see it seems to be, why shouldn't I be different than...
Let's go back to a more simpler time, a time when Democrats and Republicans got along. Back then, they went by Federalists and Anti-Federalists. We're going to go back a little bit to a few weeks ago when I talked to you about the Articles of Confederation and how they weren't working out that well. And so, the states got together and met in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. Their main goal there was to fix the Articles of Confederation. Let's remember some of the weaknesses that the Constitution was meant to fix. For instance, under the Articles of Confederation, each state had only one vote in Congress, regardless of the size of the state. Congress had no power to tax or to regulate foreign and interstate commerce, so they had no way to make any money. There was no executive branch to enforce any acts passed by Congress. There was no national court system, no one to interpret the law. Last week, we talked about the process to amend the Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, the only way to amend it was if every single state agreed. It had to be unanimous. And lastly, to pass a law, 9 out of the 13 states had to have a majority to pass it in Congress. They met in Philadelphia to fix these issues and instead ended up writing this, the Constitution. Let's recap real quick what we've learned over the past few weeks. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution outlines our legislative branch, the Congress. We're trucking along in our Constitution and we're moving on to Article 2, the executive branch, establishing the federal court system. Which brings us back to last week, where we discussed that Article 4 is interstate relations, Article 5 is the amendment process, Article 6, the supremacy clause, and Article 7, which I sort of skimmed over, which was the ratification process. Under Article 7, it was agreed that the Constitution would not be binding until its ratification by 9 of the 13 existing states. Delegates met. Americans thought they were meeting to fix the articles. So when they brought back to each of their respective states a brand new document, ratification was not easy. The push for ratification brought on an endless collection of documents, articles, and pamphlets, both supporting and opposing the Constitution. And that's not to mention the arguments that I told you earlier didn't actually happen. Two groups emerged: the Federalists, who were for the Constitution, Federalists for, and the Anti-Federalists, who quite frankly would have been happier if we just stuck with the Articles of Confederation. But the Anti-Federalists were arguing that they were against the ratification of the Constitution. So this week, we're going to take a look at what each side was saying, and maybe you can decide for yourself. Would you have been a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist?
Alexander joins forces with James Madison and John Jay to write a series of essays defending the new United States Constitution entitled the Federalist Papers. The plan was to write a total of 25 essays, the work divided evenly among the three men. In the end, they wrote 85 essays in the span of 6 months.
Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison were among the most famous of the Federalists, and they were the men who wrote the Federalist Papers, written in order to sell the U.S. Constitution to the voters. Think of it as a political ad or a commercial. They wrote under the name Publius because if someone was trying to convince you of something, wouldn't you be more apt to listen to it if it came from a seemingly neutral source who was simply a humble citizen like you and I? For instance, if someone was trying to sell you a Pop-Tart, do you want to hear from the maker of Pop-Tart or do you want to hear from someone like this?
Pop-Tarts, toaster pastries, are used drugs to snack? Pop-Tarts fix that for you. From ho-hum to so yum. Pop-Tarts pretzel is the perfect combo of sweet and salty, filled with cinnamony sugar. All in a revolutionary toaster-ready shape. It's a pretzel, but better because it's from Pop-Tarts. Let them change your life.
So they wrote under the pseudonym Publius to try to be more relatable to the American people at the time. In the Federalist Papers, they stressed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and they argued that the only way to overcome those weaknesses was with a strong federalism, a strong federal government. They stressed that while the federal government needed to be strong, it wouldn't overpower the states because the states were still an important part of our government. They also outlined that separation of powers and checks and balances was written very specifically in the Constitution to prevent anyone, any branch, any sort of government from having too much power. They also explained that elements of the people voting for the House of Representatives meant that the people were truly the source of power in our government. The papers stress the importance of Article 1, Section 9 that says that no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and with that, the government will always belong to the people. I mean, how do you argue with that? You can, and they did. Let's hear what the Anti-Federalists had to say.
We will not ratify this Constitution without a Bill of Rights or a list of the rights of all citizens, guaranteeing that they will never be violated by our government.
So before I tell you what the Anti-Federalists would say, I'm going to do something that I would normally do in class. I would call two students up to the front and I'd give them a script. One of them would be John Jay, who was a known Federalist, and one would be Elbridge Gerry, who was an Anti-Federalist. And I would give you these cool name tags. So I'll be John Jay, and I would have a backdrop that you were in a coffee shop in 1787. And I would have you read this script, and then all of you listening would start to realize what the Federalists and what the Anti-Federalists were arguing for in terms of ratifying the Constitution. So let's go at it. I will be John Jay and Elbridge Gerry. Mr. Gerry, I humbly request that you reconsider your reasons for not supporting this Constitution. But Mr. Jay, I cannot stand by it. I cannot sign my name to a document that does not secure the rights of every American. But we are accounting for that. We will have a chance to amend the Constitution. Yes, but should free people adopt a form of government that they believe needs amendment? This document is as good as we can make it. Tell me, Mr. Gerry, do you think it is possible to come up with a better plan? We cannot please everyone. I say that delaying the ratification of this Constitution will put our country at great risk. You believe that our enemies will see our indecision as weakness and our creditors may stop lending to us. But isn't personal freedom important too? We've been meeting for such a long time. What if we reject this Constitution? Would we ever be able to come up with something better? Well, then what do you suggest we do? Thank you for asking. I believe we should ratify the Constitution, give it a fair amount of time to work for the people, and fix it as time, occasion, and experience may dictate. What do you suggest we do, Mr. Gerry? I believe we should add a Bill of Rights that secures the liberties of American people. It pains me to disagree so strongly with those who signed, but I sincerely believe that the American people deserve to have their rights protected. We are putting this decision in the hands of the American people. Indeed, and I sincerely hope that whatever Constitution is finally adopted will secure the liberty and happiness of America. So what'd you think? Not of my great acting skills, but did that conversation give you a better idea of what the Anti-Federalists were arguing for? They were against the ratification of the Constitution for a number of reasons. Some of the most important being that they did not like the lack of a mention of God. They didn't like the ratification process. They didn't like that it only required 9 states. They thought there was a denial of states' rights. They thought the national government was too powerful, and they were trying to get away from that. They appreciated that under the Articles of Confederation, there was not a strong central government, and the states had most of the rights, and they wanted to keep it that way. They thought the Constitution took away some of these states' rights. And lastly, one of their most important arguments, one of their most passionate arguments, was that the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights. There was nowhere in there guaranteeing the rights of American people. Last week, I was able to show you a clip from the Senate Judiciary hearings for Judge Barrett, and how it related to what I was talking about with the Constitution. And this week, I actually wanted to show you another past clip from a Senate Judiciary hearing. This one instead is for Judge Neil Gorsuch. I have mentioned him before. He's actually the Supreme Court Justice that Donald Trump appointed to replace Antonin Scalia shortly after Donald Trump took office. And in this clip, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee is actually asking Neil Gorsuch about the importance of the Bill of Rights.
I ran into 3 different teachers who planned to use these hearings on C-SPAN to teach civics. I wonder if you could help those teachers explain, as one of them asked me, about why we have a Bill of Rights. To remind the American people, the Constitution is a negative document. It is not the government giving us freedoms. It is us giving the government a limited set of enumerated powers. And originally there was no Bill of Rights. And as a part of a compromise, we added one. Today, most people, when they think about our Constitution, think of the Bill of Rights first. Why do we have a Bill of Rights, and what fundamental difference would it make if we didn't have one?
That's a big question for us adults.
The chairman said I could have an extra hour, so take your time.
Yeah, I've got 4 minutes and 19 seconds on that. That's a big question for us adults who are where we are. It's a big question for my middle school and high school age kids. The Constitution is a negative document. The theory behind it, in short order, was to divide liberty, to divide power, the better to protect liberty. That's the theory. that you put all power in one set of hands, you're going to get tyranny. And our founders had too much evidence of that in their own time. It's kind of a hard-won inheritance. Part Enlightenment theory, right? Part on the battlefield. They saw what it was like to have power amalgamated in one set of hands. Dangerous. So they divided it. They divided it 3 ways in our federal system. You, Article 1, write the laws. And it's tough. It's supposed to be tough to protect liberty. We don't just have one house, we have 2 houses. And then it has to be signed by the president, too. Really hard. Bicameralism and presentment is designed to make legislation difficult, the better to protect liberty. The president's powers are to execute the laws, not make them, not adjudicate disputes. Our role is to decide cases and controversies between the people under law as it is, not as we'd wish it to be. We're not legislators, we're judges. The legislative power is invested in this body. That's not all. Then we divide power in a way that was quite unique, well, unusual. Federalism. So you can think of separation of powers as having a horizontal access and a vertical access, so that the federal government has certain enumerated powers and authorities. And what the federal government doesn't enjoy, the states do, as sovereigns. This country as well, we have tribes, which also bear sovereignty in our part of the world and bear recognition as such. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to recognize that fact here as a Westerner. So we have the separation of powers between horizontally, vertically. And that wasn't thought enough to protect liberty. The drafters of the Constitution, many of them thought that that would be more than sufficient, that that in fact was the main way to preserve liberty. But our founders were very suspicious and very jealous of their liberties. So they added the Bill of Rights, and they enumerated 10 of them, as you know, starting with the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, no establishment of religion, right to bear arms, the Third Amendment, which I'm glad we don't litigate much. I wonder how many of the high school kids now watching know what the Third Amendment's about. Go look it up.
Our next unit is actually going to be over the Bill of Rights, and we'll go through all 10 of them. This is one of my favorite times of the year because it's also usually during this time that we do our mock criminal trial going over some of these amendments. But in case you're dying to know and you haven't looked it up yet, the Third Amendment is no forced quartering of soldiers, and the way I always try to teach you to remember it is 3's a crowd. So going back to what we've been talking about, Constitutional Convention occurred. The 2 groups went off to try to get the 9 states to ratify it. Remember, 9 states had to vote yes. The Federalists continued to argue that we needed this strong government to lead this new nation. The Anti-Federalists said that it was too strong of a federal government. It didn't give the states any powers, and the absence of a Bill of Rights meant that our individual liberties wouldn't be protected. And kind of the solidifying point for a lot of the Anti-Federalists in states who were resisting ratification was the Federalist promise and compromise that if ratified, they would add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. So Delaware was the first state to ratify in December of 1787, followed shortly by Pennsylvania and New Jersey, also in December. By the summer of 1788, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, and New York had all voted yes to ratify the Constitution. North Carolina pushed back for a year that they would not ratify the Constitution without a Bill of Rights, and New York and Virginia only ratified the Constitution because they were promised the Bill of Rights. In September of 1789, 12 amendments were sent to the states. Remember, 3/4 of states have to approve on any amendments, and 10 of those amendments would go on to become the first 10 amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I mentioned that some of the arguments that the Federalists and Anti-Federalists had back during ratification are arguments that we still have today in politics. And so I wanted to give you a few examples. As I mentioned, other than the need for a Bill of Rights, a big source of debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists was states' rights versus the power of the federal government. And so I wanted to give you 2 recent examples. The 2015 Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court case that I've mentioned before, which said that the federal government had the right to legalize same-sex marriage, even though states had banned defend it. If you would have done that back in the beginning times of the Constitution, the Federalists would argue, well, that is what the Supreme Court has decided. It's worked through checks and balances. They've determined it constitutional. It is the power of the Supreme Court and the federal government to do so that case is okay. An anti-Federalist would have said, this is what we are afraid of. If a state wants to ban same-sex marriage, then the state should have that right. And so we had that argument, right, 200 years later. Another topic that comes up a lot is the Second Amendment. So according to the Federalists, the Second Amendment is in the Constitution. However, with checks and balances and with judicial review, the federal government should be allowed to make some limitations, if any, because it's all meant to work out that way. And so if the federal government, in reading the Constitution and going through judicial review, going to the Supreme Court, determines that there should be some limitations on gun laws, then that's okay. Anti-Federalists would argue, this is what we're afraid of. We don't want a strong federal government. Sorry, my alarm's going off. We don't want a strong federal government. We should allow the states to decide. And to tie this back to the first clip of today's Ed Puzzle, arguing is nothing new. Where do you think you would fall? Would you be considered a Federalist or an anti-Federalist? And I'm not going to tell you. I want you to tell me. Do you think you can tell? How would a Federalist translate into today's Democrat or Republican, and how would an anti-Federalist translate into today's Democrat or Republican? What do you remember? Federalist for a strong federal government. Anti-Federalist, we're concerned with states' rights. That brings me to one of your assignments for this week. I want you to watch this Ed Puzzle, and then I have another Ed Puzzle that goes a little bit more into the anti-Federalist versus Federalist debate and also talks about the Federalist Papers. And then the Google form that goes along with this week, there is an article that you need to click on to read. The article gives you further information. And then the second page of the Google form, I give you a few statements, and you're to determine whether a Federalist or an anti-Federalist would have made those statements. And as you're reading them, I want you to think, if it's something that's defending the Constitution, it's from a Federalist. If it's something that's a little skeptical of the Constitution and more a fan of the Articles of Confederation, it's an anti-Federalist. And at the very end, I have a question for you, and I want you to decide, who do you think won? Who do you think the winner was of this debate? Or maybe you choose to believe that it was the perfect compromise and there was no winner and no loser, and both the Federalists and anti-Federalists got what they wanted. All right, one last announcement, and then I am signing off. But you're going to want to hear this one because I am giving a rare opportunity for some bonus points. So as you very well may be aware, next Tuesday, November 3rd, is the general election in which we will be electing or re-electing a president. And I do apologize if we were in class regularly, we would have been discussing this more. But because we're doing this online thing, I really haven't addressed the election very much. I've already gone over the Electoral College, and so you know that is really the determining factor in who wins the election. And there is this website, it's called 270 to Win. And in it actually gives you the ability to predict the outcome of the presidential election. So when you click on the link that I'll put right here in the Ed Puzzle, but then I'm also going to put it on Classroom as an assignment. It'll take you to a map of the United States, and it will show you all of the red states are indicating that President Trump would win those states, and then all of the blue states would be indicating that Joe Biden would win those states. And so if you want to change a state from red to blue or from blue to red, you would click it until it turns to the color that you want. At the very top of the screen, you'll see it'll say how many electoral votes President Trump receives and how many electoral votes Joe Biden receives. In order to earn the bonus points, all I'm asking you to do is predict. I'm not only giving bonus points to those of you who predict correctly because pollsters couldn't even do this in 2016. But anyway, all you're going to do to tell me what you predict, and you have to do this before Tuesday, November 3rd. So this will be due Monday, November 2nd at 11:59 p.m. I will not be accepting late submissions for this because it is bonus points. You'll earn all 10 bonus points. All you need to do is on the website, you can either screenshot it and upload a screenshot, or there is a button that if you click share map, it'll actually provide you a link. And so you can submit that link to the assignment on Google Classroom. Now, if one of you do correctly predict it, like down to each state, then I can throw in more than 10 bonus points. Maybe I'll give you all my leftover Halloween candy. But I think it would just kind of be fun, and maybe it'll make watching the results roll in on Tuesday a little bit more interesting for you. All right, that's all I have for you. Make it a great week. Please have fun and be safe for Halloween. We'll see you next week.